Hi, Jeremy Cordeaux in the Court of Public Opinion. I'm just on air here to let you know that we'll be live streaming the Court of Public Opinion every Friday between 9 o'clock and 12 on jeremycordeaux.com. Please join us. We'd love to have you.
Welcome to Hong Kong Confidential. I'm Jules Hannaford and I'm your host. I'm an Australian woman and I've been living in Hong Kong for many years. I'm a mother, a teacher, an author, and I want to share my wisdom and the wisdom of others with you. Thanks for joining me and I hope you enjoy the show. Today I'm here with Professor Dan Lloyd, the head of School of Biosciences at the University of Kent. Hi, Dr. Lloyd. Thank you for joining me today.
You're welcome. Pleasure.
It's exciting to have you here. What has brought you to Hong Kong?
Well, I've been here for an event that the British Council organised over the last weekend. It was around a theme of creativity and across a range of different areas. So arts meeting sciences, how sustainable futures, skills development in young people, urban sustainability, those kinds of things. So I was part of that festival. I was asked to participate in a range of ways, notably through kind of incorporating elements of what I've come to be quite passionate about, which is communicating science and engaging people with science through, I suppose, creative ways. This time it's through interface of biological research and music, both of which I'm kind of passionate about.
That's super interesting because when we think of science, we don't often always connect it with creativity. But of course, it can be very creative because you've got to think of different ways to get to your endpoint.
That's absolutely right. And scientists are so creative in everything that they do. And the thing that's sometimes frustrating, especially engaging with students who are kind of developing their own kind of research careers, is that they don't always recognize how creative they're just being on a day-to-day basis, just by designing and executing the right kinds of experiments to ask fundamental questions of a system that they're trying to understand. So it's enormously creative. And it's why people love science, and solving all of the problem solving and the troubleshooting and all of those kinds of things that you do as a scientist, which is part of the day-to-day existence. You're doing it all the time. This is why scientists are so valued in all kinds of different careers and disciplines as they move on, whether or not it's in the sciences.
And with the introduction of artificial intelligence and the fact that the startups and entrepreneurship and the nature of employment is changing in the future, people say creativity is the way of the future, we just think maybe arts and music and theatre and stuff like that. But creativity is much broader and science is included in that.
Yes, I totally agree. And I think it's really interesting. There have been some studies done, haven't there? I think Oxford University did a study of, they didn't call it this time, but I always think of it, is my job going to be taken over by a robot? And I was really pleased to see that biological science was one of the least likely to be a subject to kind of automation alongside medicine and fine art. And certainly, yes, those areas where creativity is absolutely essential. So we really have to work on creativity, I think, for our own sustainability futures. But also, I think it's important. Yes, there will be a level of automation, and to a degree, that's going to be a positive thing. We need to now invest our energies in ensuring that we can be creative, and alongside that automation, ensure that our society develops in positive ways.
Absolutely. And so how important do you think it is for scientists to be involved in the creative arts as well while they're in school, potential scientists?
Well, I think I've always felt that for me as a scientist, the fact that I have had interest and experience from things that have not been rooted in science, that have been more alongside the arts and music particularly for me, they've brought so much to my character. And I suppose it's intangible to think about what direct influence that might have had on my sort of professional practice as a scientist, but I think it's inevitable. I often talk to our students how they come to think about their education and their training, how every part of their journey is so important in developing them as an individual, as a creative individual, then it becomes a professional. I think all of your other elements, your sports, your music, your engagement with arts, your communities around you, all of those are parcel of what makes you the professional that you are. So I think inherently it must have been important. And I think it's kind of given me rounded perspectives on the natural world, which of course is absolutely, when you're a biologist, that's what you're trying to understand.
Dr. Dang, tell me, what sort of work are you doing in around the area of cancer research?
I've been working in cancer research for a number of years, probably 20 years or so now. And my background is in DNA damage. So our DNA is subject to DNA damage uncontrollably in many instances. You know, we use oxygen as a way of generating energy. Oxygen's a very reactive molecule. And when you undergo respiration, which is how the oxygen is then used to create energy, that process fires out all of these really quite reactive species that then will damage DNA. So that is a risk factor for cancer. So that's kind of unavoidable if you breathe oxygen, which of course we have to in order to survive. But also, this lovely sunny day that we have today, you know, that's the ultraviolet rays in the sunlight. They cause DNA damage. Cigarette smoke causes DNA damage. Things that we're exposed through our lifestyles will cause DNA damage. And they are risk factors for cancer, all of them. So ultraviolet radiation, DNA damage is caused in the skin. That can lead to skin cancer. So I've been interested in the processes by which DNA damage is caused. Then also how that DNA damage is dealt with by cells, because it can be repaired in order to protect us from risk of cancer. And that has been the cornerstone of my professional work for a number of years. Increasingly, we treat cancer with DNA damaging agents because they also kill cells. And of course, when we treat cancer, we want to kill cancer cells, but we don't want to kill healthy cells.
And that's what chemotherapy and radiation, is it called, or radiotherapy?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, they can both kill the healthy cells as well.
They can. I mean, of course, what you're always trying to do is minimize the damage to healthy cells, because it's through that mechanism that you get side effects. If we take chemotherapy as the example to begin with, conventional chemotherapies are looking for cells, if you like, that are growing quickly, because cancer cells typically grow faster and divide faster than normal surrounding cells. And that's what defines them as a tumor. That's why the tumor develops and begins to take over that organ. But other cells grow quicker as well than the rest of most of our cells in our bodies, like hair follicles. So hair falls out because you destroy the hair follicles. Your gut lining regenerates quite quickly. One of the common side effects with chemotherapy is gastrointestinal problems. Other things happen depending on which drug you take, but all of those caused by action on cells that you didn't want to act upon. And in killing the cancer cell, you've also killed some cells that you didn't want to, and that leads to some side effects.
So are you working on trying to isolate the cancer cells and just work on those in some way?
Yeah, so the field of cancer research, one of the real challenges of cancer research now is to try to identify ways of selectively targeting cancer cells more selectively than we've been able to do in the past. Treating them, because trying to target them by the fact that they grow quickly is clearly not sufficient now in order to distinguish a cancer cell from a normal cell. So we're looking at a much more detailed level at individual cells in individual cancer types in order to try to have a more selective, targeted therapy for those cancers that's based on the cellular makeup of those tumours.
So will those targeted therapies vary for the different types of cancer, or is it all a similar sort of approach?
They will vary. If you take breast cancer as an example, well, we think of cancer as a single disease, and it really isn't. It's a whole family of diseases. We think breast cancer is a single disease, but it's not. That's a family of diseases. You can have several different breast cancer types, and the difference between them is the cellular makeup of those cancers, because some of them will produce a higher level of certain proteins, and that's what's made them cancer cells. For instance, an example is the estrogen receptor. Some cancers are what we call estrogen receptor positive. It's because they have elevated levels of estrogen receptor, which means that they're more responsive to the signal of estrogen, which would tell breast cancer cells to grow and divide. And so because they've got more of this protein that's telling the cells to grow and divide, they grow and divide more. Because you know it's the estrogen receptor, you can develop a drug that targets the estrogen receptor and shuts down that pathway, stopping those cells from growing and dividing in the way that they had been doing. So that's a way of being more targeted to that cancer. Now, that drug won't work on a different kind of breast cancer because it doesn't have that elevated level of the estrogen receptor. So that's what we mean by a targeted therapy. You look at what is different about that specific cancer and develop a way of targeting that cellular change that is different between that cancer and the normal cell. But it will also be different to other cancers.
Which cancers do you feel you have the most effective methods to fight at this stage?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, there are winners and losers in cancer. That's a complex issue to unpick because there are a number of different reasons for that. We've mentioned breast cancer. Actually, the prognosis for many types of breast cancer is often very good, partly because we've got really good detection methods these days, partly because there's a big public health message around self-examination. And I think females are generally better about taking care of themselves in that way than males, for instance. The whole idea of breast examination is something that's kind of become a bit more inherent in public culture.
That's true, but that's because of advertising campaigns, isn't
Absolutely.
it? And we're told and reminded to do it, whereas men aren't really told how to check their prostate or even if they can. I don't even know what I'm talking about, but do you know what I mean?
I do.
Yeah.
There are different, and of course, men are notoriously less good about going to the doctor when they feel unwell. There are those kind of cultural issues and social issues that affect that kind of diagnostic element. Whereas for breast cancer, yes, there has been a strong public health message. There's a good rate of early detection. The diagnostics are good now, so you can easily tell, relatively easily, which type of breast cancer you might have. And for each of those breast cancer types, you actually, in many of those instances, have really quite good therapies that are going to ensure that you're well treated. So survival rates for early stage breast cancer diagnosis are really quite good, others much less so.
Right. And do you think that's also to do with the fact because of these campaigns and fundraising that there's a lot more money going into breast cancer research than other cancers?
I think that's a strong factor, certainly. I often talk to my own students about this. I run a final year module in cancer biology. In fact, I run a master's program in cancer at the University of Kent. And one of the issues that we try to unpick is precisely what you've raised. You know, why is breast cancer have a better prognosis than, for instance, lung cancer and pancreatic cancer? And part of it relates to the early diagnosis, because actually by the time you're symptomatic with something with lung cancer, you've actually got quite late stage disease. So, and then you've got a surgically inaccessible site. So surgery is quite difficult. The drugs are not as good. But yes, certainly the funding climate is much more vibrant for breast cancer. And I think socially it feels much more of a shared community. I'm trying to search for the words. Responsibility is not the word, but there's a community ethos around breast cancer that perhaps doesn't exist for lung cancer, for instance, that it is projected in a different way.
Yeah, that's right. And if we look at campaigns, we then see Movember, which is raising awareness for prostate cancer. So that's probably, I imagine, gaining some momentum through this kind of program.
Yes.
But we don't have a month of raising awareness for lung cancer that I'm aware of. We might, I don't know.
No, we don't. There was a very controversial campaign, actually. I can't remember the charity, but it was a pancreatic cancer charity. And it was a very distressing image of a patient that had pancreatic cancer, was bald, so undergoing treatment, but clearly had also had secondary tumours around the skull because there were all these lumps in the skull. And the message on this poster was, "I wish I had breast cancer." And
Really?
It was really enormously controversial because, I mean, the message was quite stark and quite clear. If I had had breast cancer instead of pancreatic cancer, my prognosis would be much greater than the 2 to 3% prognosis that I have because I have pancreatic cancer. In part, there are some concern that maybe there are diseases, there are cancers that are getting less of a share
The funding,
of
yeah.
the funding.
Pancreatic cancer, as I understand it, has one of the lowest survival rates.
It
Is
does.
that right?
It does, absolutely.
Is that because it's so difficult to detect? Then when it is detected, it's very hard to find and you're very far down the track?
Yeah, it's partly the diagnosis is typically late. The diagnosis is much less refined as it is for breast cancer. Surgery is difficult and there's less drugs to treat the disease. And so really, while there have been vast increases in the way in which breast cancer is treated, something like pancreatic cancer barely moved in the last 15, 20 years. It's a difficult cancer to treat anyway, irrespective of the kind of funding issues.
But that's interesting though, isn't it?
It is. It's enormously complex. I mean, there's all kinds of social values placed around lung cancer when, you know, people might think that people get lung cancer and that's
because they've smoked
and it's an active choice.
Fault.
Yes. But actually it's more complex than that.
Yeah.
And also I'm not entirely comfortable they're the values that we project onto a disease where actually there are still elements of cancer risk are down to bad luck, and are we really in a society where we think that we have a broader responsibility to treat people irrespective of what
how
we
it came
feel,
about.
Yes, what we feel
and
our
you
own
can never
values
know
are.
anyway.
Well,
with skin cancer, I guess it's being in the sun.
I suppose there's always a risk that you can increase your risk and you can reduce your risk. Ultimately, it is still a
game of luck, isn't it? Yes, because there are plenty of people that smoke all their lives and never get lung cancer.
And will die at 105 of being run over by a bus.
Exactly.
This happens,
Yeah. What are the statistics for people affected by cancer? Do you know?
Yeah, I do. But of course, it's so variable in different countries. So the top 4, for instance, in the UK, lung, breast, colorectal, and I can't remember the 4th one. It'll come back to me.
It'll come back.
It's the big 4.
Not pancreatic.
Prostate.
Prostate, yeah. I knew it started with a P. Yeah. I'm just trying to help.
Different countries have different risk factors.
Yes, like Australia's skin cancer would be high, wouldn't it? Because we don't have the ozone layer over the top of us.
And also, of course, it's a population that has been 250 years ago migrated. A major
from the
proportion
UK with pale skin came out. And
Anglo-Saxon genetics.
Yeah, and then we've gone to this lifestyle of being outside all the time.
And the strong sun already. I mean, you think of the Aboriginal population that are much darker skinned. And
that's why
they are adapted through evolution to being present in that environment. And then a whole load of pasty white Brits came over and that it's now inherent skin cancer. It's a very interesting populational based study to see that migration and what that tells us about risk of cancer. That yes, the environment is a big factor in your cancer risk.
Is it fair then to assume that fair-skinned or red-haired or very pale-skinned people are more susceptible to skin cancer than olive-skinned people?
Yes, because again, it's a generalization of risk.
Yes.
Because there'll always be the people for whom that doesn't apply. But yes, in general, the paler skinned people, lower levels of melanin, lower levels of the natural protection that shields elements of the ultraviolet rays in the skin, preventing that DNA damage from accessing the cells where the tumours will develop. It's those people that will be at more risk typically than others.
I read somewhere that researching or looking into the fact of childhood infections or illness and whether that causes DNA damage and thus can make them at greater risk of cancer in later life. Is that anything that you're aware of?
I'm not familiar with that specific work. Certainly, it's the case that prolonged inflammation is a risk factor. So people, for instance, with stomach ulcers, if they're long-term and they're not treated, and particularly if they are subject to a particular infection, particular bacterium that's really difficult to treat, the inflammation is the factor that leads to the DNA damage that then leads to potentially tumours. I don't know how it relates to childhood, but certainly prolonged period of inflammation are risk factors for cancer.
Oh, that's interesting. What about inflamed knees? I've got terrible knees.
I think you was thinking about more acute inflammation. Cancer of the knee is less of a... Well, there is synovial tumours, but it's probably one of your lower risks.
Okay,
I wouldn't too worry.
All right.
I'd be more worried about a stomach ulcer.
Okay,
personally.
great. Okay, cool. Where did your interest in cancer first originate?
I did a degree in chemistry. I loved chemistry at school, and I started my chemistry degree. And I started thinking, oh my goodness, this is really hard.
So hard. I couldn't... Oh my God, chemistry at high school, all I can remember is the first 20 elements.
Do you know what? I absolutely loved it. I absolutely got it at school. And I started university, and I think it just reached a level of understanding those small molecules that I thought, do you know what? I'm just not getting this anymore. I came to realize that I was much more of a biologist. I loved chemistry in context. I loved it in the context of the cell. And so as I progressed through my career, I became much more of a biologist. And I suppose it was cemented. I started a PhD. There was no grand career plan, but I knew I kind of wanted to do research. And I applied for a number of different PhD research positions. And the one that I got was at the Institute of Cancer Research in London.
Right. Okay.
So I just started working on cancer. And it wasn't really necessarily by design that I thought I really want to work on cancer. I want to cure cancer. Of course, those are motivations for somebody who works on cancer. But I was applying for a range of different project types that I found were interesting.
So you could have ended up anywhere, really.
I could have been in infectious disease, or what could have been anything, could have been applying chemistry to biology.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
And have you loved it? You really enjoyed it?
I do love it. And I think it's kind of a lot of what I now do is about inspiring the next generation of researchers about the kind of what it provides for you professionally and personally. I think that creation of knowledge is so compelling. You do something, you find something out that nobody has found out before, and you have to kind of stop yourself all the time and remind yourself that that's what you're doing, because otherwise it's just day to day you're going through your job when you think, well, actually, that's amazing. I know something. Nobody else has found that out before. And it's all contributing incrementally to that knowledge about us as individuals and about diseases like cancer. So I think it's great.
That's actually what you're doing now, isn't it? Is you're training the next generation of cancer researchers.
I hope so.
How is that going, and what do you do in that sort of area?
Well, I teach undergraduate students, I have postgraduate students, and I take them from early stages of understanding how you treat diseases in general using appropriate therapeutics to more specialized understanding cancer as a disease and what makes those different cancer types different from each other, what makes cancer cells different from normal cells. I think with that underpinning knowledge, students can figure things out for themselves, do their own research. They're inspired by understanding what the problems are, what remains to be addressed. I love the idea that actually as a result of what we've just been discussing, that kind of idea that, yes, we have breast cancers in the public eye, but actually, what about those people with pancreatic cancer? And actually, my own values mean that I really want to progress this field. That inspires me, the thought that it's not just thinking about the cells and the science, but also projecting their own sense of what's right, what needs doing, on how they might want to pursue their own careers.
Yeah, so it's looking at ethics and layers of impact. What impact do you have on the individual and the community and society and things like that?
It's absolutely how it is. How can I have my impact? I have this knowledge now and I have my interests, but here's where the problem is. I think this is what researchers do. Where are the questions that need addressing? And where are the areas where we need to be working? And those are important questions.
Do you have a significant scientific breakthrough that occurred for you as a cancer researcher that has had a huge impact on cancer research?
Well, I think scientists are never quite so bold to claim such things, partly because I think...
I didn't even know if that was a decent question.
It's kind of...
Is it like saying what's your greatest talent and you can't kind of pinpoint one thing sort of thing? You have lots of little impact.
Absolutely. You have lots of little impacts. Yeah. And I think it's never always clear what is going to be the biggest impact because it's incremental increases in knowledge. And each person who's doing research builds on the next. So
yes, and you probably also don't necessarily know the value or the impact of what you've identified or created at the time. It only shows through evidence of being implemented.
Absolutely. Not when you're doing.
Yeah, later.
That's absolutely right. So, I think there are many examples of that. And I think it can go both ways. I think there are discoveries. You think about things like in vitro fertilization, which was an enormous breakthrough in the late 70s but was enormously controversial. This idea, this imagery of a test tube baby, as it was called at the time.
Yeah. And was that with Dolly the sheep? That's cloning. Oh, that's cloning. That's not IVF, but yeah.
But it's the same technology. It's rooted from the same discovery. But actually, it was really important for scientists that, yes, there was this breakthrough. And yes, there are really positive things that might come out of that, like our understanding of stem cell biology and how that might be used in therapies and to understand how we work and to treat people of the future and regenerative medicine and healing spinal cord defects and those kinds of things and paralysis. But actually, it's also really important sometimes to think of what the other consequences might be because in vitro fertilization, well, what does that mean as well as the other things? And they have to be thought through.
And I think we're seeing impacts of that now, aren't we, with people dating people that turn out to be brothers or sisters that they've never met because the sperm has gone out to many different women, the sperm donors and things like that. So it's having an impact on genetics, isn't it? And also social interactions and the way that we have to date and connect with people.
Well, potentially what ought to be happening is that there are limits placed on sperm donations and how widely they're used. Yes, and I think it's being
more regulated now, isn't it? But back in the early days, it was a free-for-all, and now we're seeing the impact with adults from that era.
Yeah.
And also there's a whole thing about anonymous sperm donation, and now they're saying that it shouldn't be anonymous. So that landscape's all changing as well, an egg donation, or you can choose.
And now the new eras of it's a minefield. These legal areas, the idea that mitochondrial donation as well, which is a new development, it allows us to harness our understanding of how things work to eradicate mitochondrial diseases in people that may be affected. But
Can you explain what mitochondrial is for the listeners out there?
I wish I hadn't raised this now because it's quite a complex process. But basically,
25 words or less.
Okay, 25 words. Okay, I'll count them on my hands. Right, mitochondria. These are the batteries of cells. So they make the energy, and they have their own DNA as well. So there are some inherited diseases, really nasty diseases that are related to the DNA that's contained in the mitochondria.
Do you mean something like Huntington's disease, for example?
Huntington's disease is not a mitochondrial disease, but there are
degenerative
are diseases that are affected by that mitochondrial DNA. So mitochondrial donation, those are typically inherited from the mother's mitochondrial DNA. So what can happen is that you have an ovum that's donated by a female that's not the biological mother, if you like, and then you can insert, this is getting very technical, the nucleus from an embryo that's been generated through IVF, but which would have had the mitochondrial DNA from the mother. So you're taking out the nucleus, which contains the majority of the DNA, and putting that into the ovum of a donor female. So the child will have over 99% of its genetic identity to the biological mother because the majority of the DNA is contained in the nucleus.
Is this a new part of IVF?
It is a new part of IVF, and it's still undergoing its regulatory frameworks because, there are always important questions such as when should these be done? Under what circumstances should these be done? And a circumstance where we may consider it should be done, and I'm not projecting any values on this, you understand, is if, as a result, the offspring would have really devastating disease that would lead to painful disease and early death, etc. So the biological identity of the child is as it would be if it was born by a standard IVF, but the risk is taken away by having a donor mother's ovum, which contains the mitochondria. So you don't have the biological mother's mitochondria, but then what it's become known as is three-parent children.
Yeah.
And so then what is the legal status, for instance, of the
half donor? Because it's only a half a donation, isn't it? It's not a full donation.
The mitochondria. So it's genetically, it'd be less than 1% of the kind of the information.
So there it comes back to ethics again. Ethics is a huge aspect of science, isn't it?
Yes. I mean, ethics in this area is, of course, really very important.
And speaking of ethics, can you tell me your opinion on animal testing?
I mean, it's important to stress with animal experiments is that when we talk about biological, biomedical research, the type of research that we've been discussing today about how we cure diseases, the vast majority of that is not based in animals at all. It's based in cells, other systems, computational models, etc. And it's really important that that work is done in order that we're minimizing the need to undertake experiments with animals. And that is the approach. That's the way in which the ethical framework of doing scientific research takes place. You'll build your body of evidence. You then undertake an ethical approval process where you complete the documentation, make a justification as to the case why experiments with animals are required at this stage, what the nature of those experiments would be, whether there are alternatives to doing so, and what you would intend to do and what the outcomes are intended to be.
Okay, so that's interesting. So there's a much more rigorous sort of justification of using animal testing in scientific research.
Right. Yeah, and so in the UK, for instance, you have to have a license to do it as well. You have to have a license to do IVF, by the way, and that kind of work, as we were just talking about. So it is that these regulations do exist. So for animal experimentation, you need a license from the Home Office in order to undertake that work. But you still have to submit applications in order to do so. So there's a very strong ethical framework around which that is done. In terms of animal experiments, I mean, I think one of the enormously controversial area, and lots of people don't like the idea that experiments are done on animals, It's important to stress, actually, the majority of people support experiments on animals where it is justified and where there is likely to be outcomes in terms of positive developments in understanding how we work and how to treat disease in particular. The public opinion is generally supportive of this work, and I think that's a recognition that there is a good framework around it. Ultimately, I think it's how we ascribe social values to what we seek to do. We have become accustomed as a society to having good healthcare, good drugs, access to medicines, access to our own livestock and pets to that kind of healthcare as well. So it's a very difficult question, I think, for anybody to ask themselves honestly to say, okay, am I prepared not to have that type of environment? Because if we do want that type of environment for ourselves and for those close to us, then the law says that animal experiments have to be important to keep us safe and to ensure that we're not subject to things that haven't been tested appropriately.
Right, that makes sense. And I think there's a big difference between animal testing for cosmetics and animal testing for medical research. There is a difference, isn't there?
And in the UK, that's been illegal since 1998.
Animal testing for cosmetics. Okay, yes.
Yes. Animal welfare, it has to be a very strong part of how we do scientific experiments. And I think there have been days in the past, in the 1970s, where people were much less careful about that kind of thing. But it's very tightly regulated now, as it should be. It really should be as tightly regulated as it is. And while I don't do experiments on it, that's not the nature of my research because I'm a cell biologist. I do think it's important, in provided we all feel as a society that we want to have the kind of healthcare that we have now.
And we want it to get better and better because there's still many problems out there that can cause people early deaths. Yeah. So, we need researchers to be working on these things and we need funding. We need to raise awareness for other aspects, not just some of the key ones that we see in the media.
And it's an important question that you ask because actually also scientists have to be open and honest about the fact that actually, yes, sometimes those experiments are needed. Yes, we need to develop alternatives and that research is going on because, it ought to reflect our social values as well, that we want to not do this as much as is possible. And so there is research on alternatives, but at the moment, it's the best we have. Yeah.
So can you share any sort of success story related to the cancer research that you've done? Have you seen any new treatments work miraculous in any patients? And do you have any story to share with us?
Well, again, it's kind of things that are incremental. And as a cell biologist, you kind of find yourself quite a long way removed from the patient. And the incremental knowledge for me comes from, I suppose, understanding these things take a long time as well to come to fruition into something that is having that impact on patients. I think you trace things back, though. I do think there's been work that I've done around DNA damage and how the cells deal with DNA damage and how proteins that are involved in those processes are now being understood as potential targets for new pharmaceuticals. You sit back and think, well, I would feel you're part of that story. That's a big story, along with thousands and thousands of other scientists and all of the rest of it.
But it must be quite rewarding as a career.
When you reflect on it, as I said, scientists don't always reflect on how the work that they do sits in the broader picture and give themselves credit to that level of incremental knowledge, which might be quite small, but has actually led to
a big breakthrough further down the track.
Further on, or even incremental breakthroughs that have just got further on. And I think that's a good feeling to have as a scientist.
Is it true that sugar plays a big part in feeding cancer cells?
Well, I think we always have to be careful of
massive generalizations.
Generalizations, I suppose, but also the idea that there's a substantial dietary element to some of the things that might be associated with risks. Cancer cells they're highly metabolically active because they're growing so quickly. So they need those fuel sources. And sugars, glucose is one of those. They are dependent on that, but I think we need to be careful that that doesn't translate into cutting sugar out of diets, for instance, without thinking carefully about what that means.
Do you see any future in the medical marijuana or cannabis as a treatment, a research area that you would move into for cancer treatment?
It's not my expertise, but I think all of us have to be as open-minded as we can be about where there are opportunities. Marijuana has been used in certain communities for sort of palliative care and end-of-life care and treating nausea and those kinds of things for a long time, actually. So the active components of marijuana are powerful molecules. So they will have effects that are potentially useful. Of course, there are restrictions around you to a degree that's appropriate. I think that's kind of opening up another debate for another day. But I think, we need to be open-minded that for some patients, there is going to be a value in things that are not always going to be supported by every people engaged with the elements of the science and the legislation. Yeah. And I'm open-minded. We're in Hong Kong. There are elements of Chinese medicine and clearly have potential. They're much less well studied. I mean, this is part of the problem, that studies that are often done around these types of areas are not very good, or they're not in large scale. They're not
funded.
Not funded.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah.
So, and that limits the extent to which you're able to do the work. But we shouldn't assume that there are not things out there that might be useful. I think we need to be open-minded, but we also need to be evidence-based as well. And I think that's important. We need to apply our knowledge and our understanding and be critical of claims, but also be open-minded to the sense that there may be circumstances where non-traditional approaches may be appropriate. There's a lot of bogus stuff out there.
Yeah.
But actually, if things are going to be effective, we need to generate the evidence and have them appropriately tested.
Spoken like a true scientist. So just to finish up, what do you hope to see as the future of cancer research?
Well, I think there are a few things. We need better diagnostics. I think that we need to be able to understand at an earlier stage of a patient having cancer. We need to detect it earlier. We need to understand what type of cancer it is much earlier, so we've got better treatment. We've got to work harder on having more targeted therapies, so that we've kind of discussed that, how we specifically target cancer cells as opposed to the healthy ones and minimize side effects. A big problem remains resistance to drugs. Cancer cells are very sneaky because they'll find their way around that drug so that they survive. And resistance to drugs potentially is becoming a bit of a problem, including some of the newer targeted drugs as we're giving them to patients and the patients respond really well. But then patients become resistant to the drugs. So we need to continue working on that and trying to ensure that we're developing drugs and understanding the likelihood of resistance emerging in those drugs. So those are key themes to be working on, I think.
So you've got to keep one step ahead.
Totally. Yeah. One step ahead of a sneaky disease which finds its way evading precisely what you're trying to do to it.
Is cancer innate, genetic, or environmentally caused, or is it all of that?
It's a mixture.
It's a mix,
so,
right.
I mean, certainly there are genetic risk factors. So, for instance, you think of breast cancer genes, BRCA1 and BRCA2. So those mutations in those genes give you a very high risk factor for breast cancer development. But it's about the environment too, I mean, smoking tells you that.
Yeah.
And it's about the interaction between them as well, because a population will have a genetic risk and it will have an environmental risk. And the likelihood of getting cancer will be some kind of combination of those two.
Do you have an opinion on the testing for the BRCA gene for breast cancer? Like Angelina Jolie did it, realized that she had a double mastectomy. Do you think that that is something that more women who have breast cancer in their family history should be doing, or?
Oh, that's difficult. I mean, it has to be a personal choice, doesn't it? I think under those circumstances would have genetic counselling where I think they can predict, and of course all it is prediction. They can predict what the likelihood is of cancer emerging at some point in their lives. And different mutations carry different risk factors. So a genetic counsellor would have to have that conversation. I think
it's so complex, isn't it?
Yeah, it is really. And it's so individual as well. Yeah. It's about what the patient feels, what the risk potentially is, what the professional advice might be, a combination of those different factors. But a complex position, anybody who's in that position, of course, has a really difficult decision to make. And I wouldn't want to project my values on that decision.
Yeah. And there we come back to ethics again. So that's really interesting. Dr. Dan, you have a TED Talk. Can you just tell us the title of that TED Talk?
The title? Do you know what? I don't think I can remember the title.
Oh, I watched it. I can't remember either. What is it? Cancer? Well, that's right.
Well, I'll tell you what it's about. It's about using antibodies, which are typically part of our immune system, which protect us against infection. They're proteins that bind to pathogens and protect us against those infections. But you can actually engineer...
So something about DNA and antibodies in cancer research.
You can engineer antibodies to treat cancer. So I guess that was the talk.
Yeah, it was. It was really, really interesting. I definitely watched it. So for my listeners out there, if they want to learn more about the in-depth aspects of the cancer research that you've been working on or that you're teaching now, they can go to that TED Talk.
Okay, yeah.
And I just want to say thank you so much for talking to me today. It's been so interesting. I really, really appreciate you giving me the time to come on to Hong Kong Confidential. And thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. Thanks.
And for my listeners out there, if you feel that this is a topic that friends or family who would be interested in, please share this podcast. And if you can rate and review us on iTunes, that would be absolutely amazing. It'll help bring me up the iTunes charts. And Dr. Dan, thanks. That was awesome. So informative and interesting.
Thank you.
Hi, Confidants. I want to tell you about my Patreon page. I've joined Patreon in the hope of getting sponsorship for my Hong Kong Confidential podcast. Patreon is a great way for my listeners to get on board and sponsor me with monthly payments, and that goes towards my production costs and rewards for my members. If you're interested in checking out my Patreon page, please go to patreon.com and search up Jules Hannaford or Hong Kong Confidential. I would really appreciate you visiting my page. So that brings us to the end of another Hong Kong Confidential podcast. I'm Jules Hannaford. Thanks for joining me, and I hope you'll be with me again next week. If you enjoyed today's podcast, please can you go to iTunes to rate and review it. I would really appreciate your feedback. You can email me at jules@hongkongconfidential.net, and you can find me on Facebook and Instagram at Hong Kong Confidential. If you'd like to hit me up on Twitter, it's at Jules Hannaford. I would love to hear from you.
Hi, Jeremy Cordeaux in the Court of Public Opinion. I'm just on air here to let you know that we'll be live streaming the Court of Public Opinion every Friday between 9 o'clock and 12 on jeremycordeaux.com. Please join us. We'd love to have you.